2 more minutes. Okay, record to YouTube.
Okay. And I wonder. Okay, we are now live. Sorry about the delay in getting live. Laptop decided to reboot. So what can we say? But here we are, and we're ready to roll. And glad to see those of you who've joined us, and welcome those who will join us later. But let's start with prayer.
Yeah, go ahead.
I will do that. Thank you, Father, for yet another opportunity to get together as part of your family, to interact with one another, to deal with questions that come up in the course of our lives and in the course of our thinking and our interactions with others. And we pray that our time together will be profitable and productive in getting some of those questions answered and getting our thoughts more closely aligned with you and our lives as well, so that we will reflect you more clearly to those around us, especially in this important season when people tend to think perhaps a little more about matters relating to you. Thank you. Goes to issue. Good. Okay.
Hi, kids.
All right. In talking about stuff for this evening, we've got a number of questions, some of which are leftovers from previous months. But we did decide that we do just a little bit of something seasonal, since the questions tend to arise at every now and then, and for yet another couple of reasons. Number one, there was a discussion here at the synagogue related to seasonal matters just a couple of weeks ago, and the very next day, lo and behold, Biblical Archaeology Review came out with a feature article.
Pictures and everything.
Exactly. Pictures and everything on December the 25th being the date of Yeshua's birth. So we thought we'd just share a couple of quick reflections from our previous discussions, as well as from that particular article. Barb, you remembered the date of when we did this last year. Do you remember the date of it still?
I think it was December 18th.
Okay, so for a fuller discussion of this, look at December 18th's version of Stump the Stars Jewish Style.
2021.
2021, last year.
Last year.
Exactly. If you want a really complete discussion of this, get just make a request for the version that I utilize in the Jewish Fruits and Foundations of Scripture, part 1. And that's probably, I'm guessing that's probably about a 3-hour session. So either one of those things are available. But for tonight, we just wanted to share a couple quick reflections as a result of the conversations from a couple weeks ago, as well as a very timely article by Biblical Archaeology Review. One of the main points of the article, we're going to now call it BAR because it's a lot more quickly said than Biblical Archaeology Review. One of the main focuses of BAR was trying to trace the earliest record that we have referencing the date of the celebration of Yeshua's birth. And in that particular article, as we talked about it a year ago as well, you have what was it, of Hippolytus. It was a statue of Hippolytus?
It's a statue of Hippolytus that's in the Vatican.
Got it.
And it has inscriptions all around the base. So there's a sculpture, but around the base is a lot of text that goes on and on for a while, where the chronicle is like etched into the base of the statue.
And just a quick reminder of who Hippolytus was. I've occasionally called him Hippolytus. That helped me remember, because then I know him as Hippo for short.
But he wasn't from Hippo.
No, he wasn't from Hippo. That was Augustine, wasn't it?
Somebody was from Hippo.
Yeah,
Yeah, we used to be a city.
yes. Anyhow, I wanted to, while I'm thinking about it, I wanted to double check. Okay,
Excuse him while he looks on his phone.
I'm looking. Okay, that's, all right, good.
Apologies. Yeah.
Because there was somebody else I wanted to reference that was not referenced by the BAR article. Anyhow, it dates this particular inscription to the year 220 of the Common Era. And here Hippolytus is referencing December 25th as the date of Yeshua's birth. The exact quote, and I don't know if it comes directly from this particular inscription or from something Hippolytus wrote. He said, and I quote, "The accepted date of Jesus' birth is December the 25th." End quote. Now, who is this guy? Hippolytus. Hippolytus was taught by a man whose name is Polycarp. Polycarp is a person who was taught by a man whose name is Irenaeus. Irenaeus is a man, no, change that around. Hippolytus was taught by Irenaeus. Irenaeus was taught by Polycarp. Polycarp was in fact a student of John the Apostle. Remember, John the Apostle is the one into whose care Yeshua gave his mother Miriam. And you would think if anybody would know when Yeshua was born, it would be his mother. And with John being the one who cared for her after Yeshua's death, you would think John would also be privy to that information. And then he would pass that on to Polycarp, Polycarp to Irenaeus, Irenaeus to Hippolytus. So you've got a direct line back to the source for this. And the date of the inscription is 220. The actual statement of Hippolytus may very well have been even earlier than that. That's early 3rd century. Because if he says it's the accepted date of Yeshua's birth, that means prior to this time period, it was already being observed as the date of Yeshua's birth. So that brings us then into the 2nd century, probably late 2nd century, maybe even earlier. We're not quite sure. There is another reference to the birth of Yeshua in conjunction with December the 25th, and it's by Telesphorus, and he's writing about the year 125, so that pushes us 100 years even earlier. Now, two things that, and I'm trying to remember if the BAR article referenced them, but two things that are often connected with the so-called misalignment of Yeshua's birth being December the 25th, is it's often said, well, it's just that the early church decided to build on an existing holiday, pagan holiday, and then to transform it so as to, should we put it, utilize it, use it for their own purposes.
Well, and I think that model is seen in more recent times,
Yes.
like into the 1700s, the 1800s.
Right.
Where especially the Roman Catholic Church would send out explorers, especially in South America, and they would use the indigenous holidays and they would try to transform them into Christian holidays. So I think people are seeing what happened historically in the 1800s and saying, well, that's what they were doing
They
back
must have been
then.
right.
So it's like a case of interpreting through backwards looking.
Yeah. And by the way, this same approach is often done in areas of what are often called critical theology, as it tries to relate the reasons and the locations in the season for the Jewish holidays, that they were adapted from something going on there. But that's a whole other story. Back to this particular adaptation. The adaptations are usually connected with, and this came up in a conversation just last night in this very building, in this very room. It's often connected with, well, they just took over the, what is it? The Festival of Saturnalia. Okay?
Have you heard that? That's common.
Very, very common so-called pagan connection. Well, the Festival of Saturnalia, as it turns out, was celebrated December the 17th to December the 21st. Now,
Not really.
it doesn't match up, does it? Now, I would figure that these people knew the difference between the 17th and the 21st and the 25th. All right, so that connection does not hold. Sometimes the connection was made, and I think the BA article does point out, sometimes the connection was supposedly to have derived this celebration from a holiday called Sol Invictus. Okay, now here's the interesting thing about Sol Invictus. The first time that was celebrated was the year 278. Now, when is this inscription dated? 220. He may have written something even earlier, and certainly Telesphorus 100 years even earlier. So we just want to dismantle that kind of connection as the source of some sort of takeover of a pagan celebration. I think that's about, I will say before we bring in the how should we put it? The vision of the shepherds.
Actually, looking
Hang on.
at the text.
Actually looking at the text. I have long maintained, and I've shared this with you, that Yeshua was born not on December the 25th, but on the equivalent in the Jewish calendar, Kislev the 25th, in which case it would have been the first night of Hanukkah. And that makes sense if you read carefully the imagery that you find in all four of the Gospels, but it also makes sense because Luke chapter, I think it's Luke chapter 1, is very clear as to when the conception took place. It took place in the 6th month of the Jewish calendar. All right. Now, we are all familiar with the fact that after conception, 9 months later, along comes supposedly a baby. So that means this baby would have been born in the 15th month of the Jewish calendar, except you know that there aren't 15 months in a Jewish calendar. So that makes it the 3rd month of the Jewish calendar, right? Okay. Tishri, Eshvan, Kislev. So there's indication even in the gospel text, if you read it carefully, thank you for reminding me about reading the text carefully, or I would have forgotten that, as to when this is likely to have taken place. Now, from the vantage point of the shepherds.
Well, I was going to say there's one, maybe you should just say a couple of sentences. In Messianic circles, the confounding thing that they throw in is they interpret one of the minor prophets to be saying, isn't it, the one that has so-and-so is going to occur on the 24th of Kislev. And they claim that is
The conception.
the conception. And if you take that point of view, I don't know why you would take this. I forget even what prophet, because my brain is still not working. It's a later one.
Haggai.
Hey, yeah, Haggai, whose name, ironically, has the root of holiday, has a chag, is a holiday. And so he's like, in Latin, this would have been the name Festus. So fest, person born on a holiday or something like that, but Haggai, and not Haggai. But Haggai talks about this and mentions the 24th of Kislev as being an important date for something to happen. And unfortunately, some Messianic Jews just glom on that and say, see, that means that's the conception and therefore he was born here.
However, the text literally says that starting after that date, so the 25th of Kislev, something truly will happen. And if you read it in its context, and it's chapter 2, both at the beginning and at the end, then it seems far clearer to be a reference not to his conception, but to his birth, which brings us back into the day after the 24th of Kislev. Okay, now I'm going to go grab a drink while you start talking about
Yes.
shepherds,
Okay,
because I haven't grabbed a drink.
as I happened to mention last night, it's always important to keep your finger on the text, to not build up ideas in your mind and not read the plain meaning of the text. So we all know the beginning of The birth story begins with a special thing that happened outside one night. What was the special thing that happened outside one night that needs to be remarked upon? We can all do it because it's in half the Christmas cards you're going to get in the next 3 weeks. There were shepherds abiding in the fields. Let's stop right there. Let's stop right there. What fields? Outside of Bethlehem, correct? There were shepherds, and they weren't just hanging out for the evening. They were staying there. They were somewhat living there. They were hanging out. They were having a camping trip. Why were the shepherds having a camping trip? They were watching sheep. That seems to be a fairly normal thing for a shepherd to do. What are the sheep doing? They're grazing in the field. Once again, what fields? The grain fields that are all around Jerusalem even today. What? When is the only time of year that you would allow sheep? In fact, you would encourage sheep to go into the fields of grain. Is it when the grain is just sprouting out of the ground in the spring? No, not then. How about when it's growing? Do you let the sheep in the field when it's growing? No. How about after the harvest? Well, you might think that, but there's another step that must be taken. You can't just have harvested, let's say it's barley, and then you let the sheep in the field. That might be your first inkling. However, what is the commandment for in the process of harvesting grain? What must be allowed? Gleaning must happen. It happens simultaneously with the harvest, and then it continues on for a couple weeks after the harvest, when those people who are poor and need food, this is part of their Social Security program, is that they can go to the fields that have been harvested and pick up all the grain that's left behind, because harvesting is not a perfect, doesn't totally wipe out every single plant in the field, and grain and stalks are left behind. The stalks were important for poor people because they needed to feed their animals too. And so grain stalks were fed to the animals and the grain was ground up. It takes a couple weeks after a harvest is completed before you could hypothetically let sheep into the field. So, what time of year must it be when those sheep that we see and their keepers, and it says they're abiding there? This is not just they're walking through town, they happen to stop off for a little burger and they see stuff in this. No, they're staying in the fields. They're staying in the fields. And that's when the angels visit. It must be between the harvest and gleaning portion and before the new crops are sown. Does that make sense to everybody? You can't put them out there when you sown the grain. It has to be right before that. Guess what month that is? Kislev, at least for the bulk of the majority of the fields around Bethlehem. So the text assumes that you understand why there are sheep in the fields, because normally sheep are kept in a sheepfold, except for this 1 month or so, could be 5 weeks, before the winter crops are planted. Remember, this is Israel. This is not Minnesota. So they have different times that they plant their crops at. And the barley harvest is going to be, you already know when the barley harvest is going to be. It happens along with the holiday where the lovely woman from out of town comes and gleans on behalf of her and her mother-in-law. And that would be in late May, early June, correct? So the barley is harvested then, and in order for that to be harvested then, it has to be planted like around January. The sheep cannot be in the fields at another time of year because you'll stick it out there and ruin the whole crop. Because they will eat everything. Plus, we know that amongst these shepherds, we think of shepherds as sort of poor people, people that are hired day laborers who come in for rich people who own a lot of sheep or cattle, or for shepherds, sheep, and they are supposed to protect the sheep, especially when they're out in the fields. Because normally they're put out to pasture, but then brought in every night into the sheepfold. This is more than you ever wanted to know about shepherding, I'm sure. But the author of the birth narrative thinks you know these things, giving you a lot of credit. He thinks you already know this. It doesn't need to be explained. The sheep are out in the field because it's winter. It's winter. And that's the time when they go out in the field. Why would they put them out in the field other than, yum, they get to eat a lot and it's free food? You know, this is free food. It doesn't have to be, it's not straw. And in the summer, the straw runs out and then they send sheep out and they will literally bite the ground until they find some roots to munch on. And it's not very filling and not very fattening. The grain and the stalks in the field in the winter, oh, that fattens those sheep right up, which is good because it'll be just in time for Passover when they're going to be needing a lot of sheep for a lot of people just up the road in Jerusalem. Remember, I've said many, many times, it's a 15-minute drive in a car from Jerusalem to downtown. From Jerusalem to downtown Bethlehem. If you're out in the fields, it's even shorter. But you could definitely drive a group of sheep up to Jerusalem and leave them off there in the spring. It would only take a day and a half of herding sheep and getting them up to Jerusalem. So you're sort of stuck. Once you read the text, it says they were abiding in the fields because they were watching the sheep who were eating the leftovers from the harvest and the gleaning when they're visited. Now, here's another thing we know about shepherds outside of Bethlehem. Priestly families who were in charge of sacrificing sheep. So the knowledge of a career in those days was done a lot like was done in the Middle Ages. You had a family guild or a family expertise that people came to you for. So if you wanted to have some knowledge about sheep and what kind of sheep would be available to sacrifice and how to protect sheep so that more of your flock would be suitable for sacrificing. They couldn't have a lot of scars or a lot of bloody wounds on them or have shrunken, one of their legs is shrunken. All of those would make a sheep not be qualified to sacrifice at the temple. So you would have teenage guys along with the shepherds, or maybe also just being shepherds because that's their job, to learn their trade and to learn what can harm a sheep. And so you've got some of the interns from priestly families are sent there once they come of age to abide in the fields with the sheep and learn firsthand how to prevent sheep and also how to cure minor scratches and wounds, minor ones, so when they heal, once again, they could be sacrificed. So you've got the mixture of not just plain old shepherds, but priests, family guys who are there learning how to take care of sheep successfully. And if that now doesn't paint a different picture of the guys hanging out in the field are visited by angels, and they're told something that's a miracle. Who do you imagine heard about the miracle first? I would assume not just people in Bethlehem, but I would assume a whole bunch of people in Jerusalem, because the interns are there and they're going to spread the word to mom and dad, who are by definition of priestly families. So the information will be spread a long way away, lest you think it's just five guys in a room and then the magi show up. It's not like that. The word has gotten around. It's even gotten to Herod, remember, when the magi show up. All right, so I hope that's helpful to you, because you ignore the context in the fields to your detriment when you're trying to understand what the heck is going on in this scenario. And the writer assumes you know why those sheep are there and why those shepherds are there. Unfortunately, nobody knows.
Okay, two further reflections. One, I did hunt up the text that Patrice was suggesting from our festival dude, Haggai.
Okay.
Call him festival dude from now on if you would like.
Festus.
I like festival dude better, but whatever. He says, this is what the Lord Almighty says, in a little while, once more I will shake the heavens and the earth. And he says, I will fill this house with glory, and the desired of all nations will come. And that's what's connected then with the rest of this text, which talks about the 24th day of the 9th month of Kislev. And then it says immediately after that, now give careful thought to this from this day forward. Hence the reference to beyond this Kislev, the 24th, 25th, and following. Fill this house with glory. If Yeshua was in fact born on the first night of Hanukkah, when he showed up in the temple for his Brit Milah, his circumcision, it would have been one, the 8th day of Hanukkah, and the menorah would be completely lit up. Fill this house with glory. One other, as you were talking about the shepherds, it reminded me, I think it's a midrash, concerning a place called Migdal Eder, which is right in the Bethlehem neighborhood. And the midrash connects that place with the coming of the Messiah. So there we go. Did we get it covered sufficiently, I think? Okay. Then, having set the stage, any questions from you? All right. Any questions from those of you who've joined us live? No? All right. In that case, we will go to the questions that were submitted. And this comes from about a month or so ago. I've been watching videos on YouTube from Israel. What is the reason for Ashkenazi Jews putting their noses up at Sephardi Jews? And then there's a second question, but we'll start with that one.
I'm assuming that you're referring to more modern times. I'm assuming, okay, that in general, starting, I would say in the 1880s, is that when the first Aliyah
I think
began?
it's closer to the 1840s, actually, if I remember.
Really earlier rather than later?
I remember this exhibit at the Citadel of David that I think said it was the 1840s.
Yeah, I'm ready to go with that. All right. First of all, what's the difference between Ashkenazic Jews and Sephardic Jews? For Jewish people, you know which of those two, I don't know what you want to call them, groupings,
Yeah.
that your family is in. Ashkenazic Jews celebrate in their synagogue services. They have different prayers, different readings than Ashkenazic Jews do. In general, and this is hard to say in the abstract, Ashkenazic Jews were the Jews who, back in 70 AD, when the Romans were trying to put down the revolution and they kicked all the Jews out of Jerusalem. So there's a massive exodus of Jews, but it's in 70 AD. The ones who went to the north and the west, in general, became known as Ashkenazi Jews. And the Jews that escaped by going to the east and the south were known as Sephardic Jews. Sepharad is the name of that. All right. Yes, dear.
And a quick aside, as well as those Jews who did end up being able to remain in Israel, were also part of this
All right.
Sephardi package.
In general, Ashkenazic Jews lived in northwestern Europe. The group that went there and populated in Germany and in some of the Eastern European countries, but also in France, and we'll leave Spain for a minute. Okay. The Sephardic Jews are the ones that ended up to the east and the south. That means all along North Africa, and also east into Greece. Jews were in Greece and settled in Greece. This is after the Romans pushed the Jews first out of Jerusalem and then out of the whole nation in general. That was in 120, I believe.
135.
Where they made Jerusalem into a Roman city.
Yeah,
They said no Jews may live here anymore, but that was, but you could go and live in other parts of what we would consider Israel today. So the Sephardic Jews, who are the South and the Eastern group, they're in, after year 600, they're in Muslim lands mainly. So there were tremendous numbers of Jews in what we would consider Arabic Muslim lands. There were also Jews from the Assyrian exile after Assyria attacked the northern kingdom and they fell. Those people scattered. But I'm talking about the main lot of Jewish people who were in what we would call Israel while the Roman Empire was in its heyday, let's put it that way. So that's a different group of Jews than the ones that went to the north and the west. And they've developed different traditions. They started out with the same, and then they developed different traditions, and they developed different languages to use as Jewish languages. So the Sephardic Jews who lived all across northern Africa and into the East, the Near East, and the Far East, they were separate, and they turned out to be poorer. Once Islam came to the forefront, they didn't mind if Jews lived in Islamic countries. They didn't mind it at all, but they would charge you a tax for the luxury of being in a Muslim country. Jews could pay a tax called a dhimmi. You were in the dhimmi, which meant you were knowledgeably a second-class citizen. Everybody knew that, and it wasn't hidden. Everybody knew that and admitted that Jews were called the people of the book by Islam. And Islam treated them not so bad, but it kept taking money from those communities that were scattered to the east and the south. The Jews that went to the north and the west, in other words, on foot, everybody traveled on foot to get to these places. They scattered in amongst the Germanic peoples in there. There's a good, you can visit, as we did. We were taken on a tour of Worms. I know the name of the city looks like Worms, but it's not Worms. They won't let you get away with saying Worms. You have to say Worms. So we were taken on a Jewish tour of Worms, I'd say about 10 years ago. Maybe longer than that.
I think maybe.
Right though. Anyway, it seems like 10 years ago. And they showed us the gravestones of Hebrew-speaking people that were buried outside Worms, outside of the city wall where Jews were buried. Remember, Jews will never bury inside a city. It's forbidden. And there's health reasons for this, even though they may not have known that. God had us do a whole bunch of things. Whether or not he told us the reason why we needed to do that, it turns out as we mature and we learn things about medicine and about public health that God had really good ideas, whether the Jewish people themselves knew why. They just do it because God said to do it. And he didn't explain how nuclear propulsion works either, because they wouldn't have understood it. He didn't explain all these public health issues. He just said, do it this way, otherwise you're going to have a problem with sickness and death. And sure enough, God was right. Isn't that weird?
Weird.
That he was right. Yeah. Anyway, so in Germany, we know there's a history since about 700. That's when those graves were buried. And they do not face east or west, these Jewish graves. Guess where they face? They face Jerusalem, these Jewish graves. That's another indication that along with a gravestone, oh, they're not part of the Germanic, tribes. All right. Here's what happened through the years. There came a time that's called the Golden Age of Judaism. Isn't it called the Golden Age of the Jewish people?
It's certainly in line with Golden Age of Spain.
And it's more than Spain because it has to do with Islam too.
Right, yeah,
So
right.
remember in the 800s and then the 900s, Islam, which was founded in the 600s, they had conquered the then known Near East, and then they started to sweep across North Africa, and you'll remember that they ended up in Spain across Gibraltar. So you have militant Islam armies, and behind the militant Islam armies, and they set up a government in Spain. This is called the Moorish times in the 8 and the 900s, which we can think of it as, oh, that's terrible, there was a big war, but there were a lot of benefits to that war, because following that war, which established an Islamic state of Spain, correct?
I believe so.
It brought also some of the wisdom and knowledge that the Arab peoples had, like numbers and algebra and those kinds of things with them. So there were Jews that accompanied behind the Islamic armies and also settled across North Africa, where there already were some Jews, but there was a whole kingdom of Jews underneath the Islamic nation that was in Spain. And this whole time period is called the Golden Age of Jewish literature.
Yeah, it was.
And
because Rambam comes out of this eventually.
Please recall, this is when Northern Europe is going through the Dark Ages. So what's going on up north? The Dark Ages. What's going on? North Africa and Spain? Oh, tremendous amount of learning and literature and bringing wisdom that had been lost up in the north. And so that they really were on top of the world in Spain. Here's what happened. So the Sephardic Jews that came alongside or after the Islamic armies, because they were always looking for, remember, they were desperately poor. So they were looking to go anywhere where they could have more wealth and be at greater opportunities for their kids. Same reason that anybody does it. These Jews started speaking a Proto-Spanish language, because when you're in a country and you can't communicate with those people, you learn to speak their language, and that's what happened to Sephardic Jews. And Sephardic Jews developed a language that was partially Spanish, medieval Spanish, and also had a few Hebrew elements in there. Nowadays, this language is called Ladino. Ladino. And there are many people in Europe, Sephardic Jews, who still speak Ladino. It's a parallel with Yiddish. Because what happened to the Ashkenazic Jews? Well, they went to northwestern Europe. They started speaking a hybrid language to their German neighbors and to their Russian neighbors. So a very large grid of German, plus also a very substantial grid of Hebrew, plus some Russian words. And so they ended up with a Jewish language. So Ladino is a Jewish language, and Yiddish is another Jewish language based, you would say, if you studied German for a while, you would know a lot of Yiddish. You'd know more Yiddish than you ever thought. So not only are they two different people groups after these centuries, but they speak two different languages, and they live in two different areas of the world. When it came time to leave those nations and come to America, here's what happened. So a large percent of Ashkenazic Jews came to America, a whole bunch of Ashkenazic Jews down through, from starting in the early 1800s and through until the 1920s. The large percentage of Jews that came to America were Ashkenazi. And so that's where Yiddish got established in America, et cetera, et cetera. However, that isn't to say that no Sephardic Jews came to America, because ironically, Sephardic Jews were the first group to come to the New World. What? Sephardic Jews are the first Jews in the New World. Well, how did that work out? Remember, there was that thing called the Inquisition. The Inquisition, remember, started around the Mediterranean. It was headed by the Roman Catholic Church. They were trying to drive, or at least to convict Jews who were pretending to be Christians. That's what the intent of the Inquisition was. And so if they had a hint that you were a Christian, but it was just a name only, that you really were doing Jewish stuff in your basement, and that's exactly what they would do, then the Inquisition would round you up and get you to confess either that, Christ is your Lord, or that you're a Jew. And if you're a Jew, then you had three choices in 1492, there was an edict that came down from Isabella, the one that gave the money to Columbus to come to America. Well, she wasn't all that great, it turns out, for Jews, because she said, you have three choices, right? Convert and be baptized, go into exile, or walk into the sea and drown. That was your choice. So when the Inquisition spread from Italy and Spain, it went to Portugal. From Italy, Spain, and Portugal, the Sephardic Jews ran to Amsterdam, accepted the Sephardic Jews that were being pursued by the Inquisition. And so you have a sizable Sephardic Jewish community in Amsterdam there, and they lived there happily for a couple hundred years. And that, once again, is a very important time period in Jewish history, because they were saved from the ravages of the Inquisition. But you know that these nations of Spain and the Netherlands and Portugal, about this time, remember 1492 is like in the middle of the Inquisition. So now we're in the 1500s. And what did people from those nations tend to do? Oh, they wanted to go west and settle those brand new lands. And so there were groups of Jews, especially from Amsterdam, who said, we're going to get on the ships that are going to the New World, and they're not going to find us there. The Inquisition will never get us. We'll be able to live in peace. Sort of rhymes with, people called the Pilgrims the next century, that as Christians came to the New World so they wouldn't be persecuted. Ironical. So the first Jews that ever entered into North and South America were Sephardic Jews. The main lot of them were in South America at first. That's where they all came to Brazil. They came to those northern South American countries that are right on the water there. And then finally, the Inquisition came to the New World. So those Jews that had settled there, Sephardic Jews who had settled in the brand new world, said, we must go and find a new place. And guess where they went? They went north. They came north. And so the first settlements that have synagogues of Jewish people are in South Carolina and in southern states. And also a very, very hardy group came up to Boston and Philadelphia, and they were the Sephardic Jews. After that time, immigration, it was all Ashkenazic Jews. That's a long story to tell you that America is a country of immigrants. Yes, yeah. Modern Israel is double that, a country of immigrants. When you go to Israel, here's what you see. You don't see Jerry Seinfeld. In fact, well, you could. Not everybody has side curls and a black hat, and the women don't all have head coverings. Most people look like average people you'd see on television anywhere. But it's a mixture. It's a mixture of Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazic Jews. And in the history of the nation of Israel, Sephardic Jews were the poor ones. They had no education. They had no money. They had no civilization. They had no class. So within Israel, they were like, ew, you give Jewish a bad name. Just like in America, who the vast majority that came were Ashkenazic Jews. They were rich. They were the ones who could buy their way out. They could sell their home and their goods, and then they could take the trip and come over, and then they would work hard. And there were so many Ashkenazi Jews, but once again, they would look at the Sephardic Jews and go, ick, you don't speak Yiddish, you're poor, you don't have any culture, you don't have any civilization, we don't like you, you give us a bad name. So it's a human/immigration problem that happened not just in America. That's a common thing for us. Remember, there was such a thing as Black Irish. And I don't mean that their skin was black. This is in the late 1800s. But there were people who came over from Ireland, and they were called Black Irish. Why were they called black if they were not black? Their hair was black. Well, why is that so terrible? It was terrible, and there were signs to keep those Black Irish out of places. Why would they do that? Because those were the ones who had all the kids, and those were the ones who were poor, and those are the ones who had no education or only a limited education, and so nobody else wanted to hire them because they're icky. And when the Eastern European Jews came over to the United States, the Ashkenazic Jews went, oh, they're worse than the Sephardic. These people they're barely civilized. They're just icky and horrible. And they speak a funny language, and I don't even recognize their Yiddish. I no longer want to speak Yiddish. I want to speak English because all civilized people speak. See how that works? This is a human prejudice problem. It's a human prejudice problem. So when we say that the Ashkenazi looked down on the Sephardic, yeah, they did. Just like Americans look down on Black Irish. By the way, we think, do not quote me on this, I'm going to do more research, that the Black Irish were called Black Irish because they had black hair and because they were Catholic and because they had a lot of kids and they didn't have any money and they came to America and they wouldn't hire them. And so they had no money and they had all these black haired kids. So that's the Black Irish, and nobody wanted to hire them. See how this works? Sort of a human problem. Am I going on too long about this? It's important for everybody to know the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazi
And how they
Jews.
handle, how it happened.
And how it turns out that the Ashkenazi Jews that were more well off and more highly civilized and educated and had trades that people understood, whereas the Sephardic people were just poor. Now, ironically, remember I told you there's two Jewish languages. There's more than two, but the two main ones in the world are the Sephardic Jewish language, which is Ladino, strongly based in Spanish. So much so that I had a friend over at University of South Florida. She was right across the room, right across the hall from me. And then the name on her door was Maria S. Formas. And Maria S. Formas, who taught Spanish, she taught Latin American literature and she taught fourth year Spanish. And I finally, after I worked there for about 6 months or so, I happened to chat with Maria. And it turns out Maria is Jewish. And I just looked at her. She said, yes, I'm Sephardic. And I went, oh, you're Sephardic. She goes, I was born and raised in Greece. And I looked at her. Yes, I was born and raised in Greece. And so I'm an expert at Greek. But I was trained in Spanish because Ladino is so close to Spanish. It just was a hop, skip, and a jump for me to become an expert in Spanish. And she taught courses. I'm assuming she could have taught Greek too, but she taught Spanish language courses, especially feminist courses. So Maria and I got to be buddies. And frankly, she was the first person I'd ever met who had this combination of born and raised in Greece, studied Spanish because it was practically a native tongue for her based on Ladino, and then came to America in order to teach Spanish. Whereas if you know German, you can really function in Yiddish. Yiddish is not a dying language any more than Ladino is a dying language. They all have babies being born, and they all have communities that speak them still. So why did they look down on this part? Why do people look down on other immigrants? Because there's ones you want to have that come and live next to you and be your neighbors, and then there's other people in other parts of the world. You don't want them coming here and living next door to you and being your neighbors. And if they're the same religion as you, that's even more embarrassing. You give blank a bad name. It's that right there, that issue. So when this last point, I'm just going to finish up on. When the settlers came to Israel in the first Aliyah in the middle of the 1800s, they came speaking Yiddish, some came speaking Ladino, some came from whatever country they came from and didn't speak either Yiddish or Ladino. But the vast majority of immigrants for the nation that we now know as Israel spoke Yiddish. That was by numbers. Yiddish was the most important language to know starting in the 1880s and moving along. What happened was there needed to be a vote. So the Jews established universities in what was then still the Ottoman Empire. And a decision had to be made about what language was going to be used to teach the students at the various universities around what we call Israel nowadays. And the first discussion came up, the University of Haifa said, we need to decide what language we're going to have to educate our students in. And Hebrew won by only about 10 votes. What normally people guessed that it was going to be German, that German was going to be that language of education that all Israelis would be taught in. And it was only by a few votes that Hebrew was named the language of the Technion and University of Haifa and all these other colleges around the country. But here's the thing. Yes, but how should we pronounce the Hebrew that we're going to be teaching everybody? Because Ashkenazic vowels are different from Sephardic vowels. And here's the decision that was made. We are going to teach Hebrew with the Sephardic vowels. What? You're going to do what? You're going to, what? Why can't they be the Ashkenazi vowels, the ones that we're all familiar with? Because it's not. We're not choosing them because we're choosing the oldest Jewish community that we can possibly find. And those would be from the very sheltered nation of, and it just flew out of my mind, Ethiopia. Ethiopia Jews, and then down along the southern part of the south of Saudi Arabia, on the coast down there, the airlift. Where they brought them in an airlift overnight.
That was Ethiopia. Right?
Yeah, but there's another group that they brought.
Oh, yeah.
Very small group of Jews. They said those are the oldest Jewish communities that we can find. Therefore, we're going to use their vowels, and they were Sephardic vowels. So when you go to Israel and you learn Israeli Hebrew, you will learn Sephardic vowels and not Ashkenazi.
So modern Hebrew is based on that. And if you listen carefully, even in our synagogue, if you listen carefully, you can hear as the blessings are being recited, you can hear people who will say,
Good Shabbos.
no, well, I wasn't going to go there. Go ahead.
Good Shabbos. That would be Yiddish.
That would be Yiddish as opposed to Shabbat Shalom. You will hear people pronounce Adonai as Adonai. That's
A lot of
Ashkenazi.
ois.
That's
That's
Ashkenazi.
Ashkenazi. That would be Jerry Seinfeld would say oi, oi, oi.
You will hear people, instead of saying Amen, will say Omein.
Omein,
That again is Ashkenazi.
Ashkenazi. In
So-
Israel, you say Amen.
Yep.
You say Amen and
You say Adonai.
Adonai.
So modern Hebrew is based on that, and we have by and large here at this synagogue chosen to pronounce things in modern Hebrew, but there are people who've been brought up differently and they can't get over the way they've been brought up.
Slip into their old ways.
So,
It's normal for modern Israeli synagogues in America. They switched from their Ashkenazic pronunciation. I think back in the 1930s and 40s, they switched knowingly to Israeli Hebrew. So it's not who was winning the war all along, but who ended up winning the war is the important. I'm sorry, that took me a long time.
but that's all part of the background that underlies the kind of unfortunate interaction that still occasionally goes on, even in Israel, between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. And they're doing better at it, but there are still times when
It's hard to shake stereotypes,
Yeah.
that communities have about each other. They're very hard to shake. It's very hard to raise up new generation that doesn't have a negative feeling about that group or this group.
And if I remember correctly, but need to double check this, there is a certain rotation of who is the chief rabbi of Israel, and it goes back and forth between the head Ashkenazi rabbi and the head Sephardi rabbi. So that at least was an attempt to try to level things. And, the leveling still goes on. And trying.
Because prejudice between groups
Right,
never
yeah.
gets solved.
Okay. Next question.
I hope that answered the question.
If not, ask further.
Yeah.
Are the dietary laws for just Jews, or are Gentiles expected to keep kosher? Okay. That
It's your
raises,
turn to talk, my voices.
no, you got to pick up on this because it has to do with food in general. First of all, the answer to the question is yes and no. It is ultimately settled in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 15, but we'll get to that a little later. But it goes back to the difference between clean and unclean animals, but even more so, and by the way, clean and unclean animals Yeah, I read from one question. There is another question that also came in a little earlier or within a couple weeks of that. Where's the question he raises?
It's at the end.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It is also related to the same question as to what kind of food or what kind of diet should we be having? Or what should non-Jews be having? And in the second question, it references going back to the time of Noah and the difference between clean and unclean animals. And the person who wrote this did a very good summary, and maybe at the end I might read this summary. But
TikTok.
TikTok. The issue is, according to biblical standards, what is food and what is not food? But as Patrice is about to tell you, the whole concept of what is acceptable food or what is edible as food varies from culture to culture. Take it away.
I'm going to lose my voice, but it's fine.
Drink some more water.
Yeah, I will. So, the prior question about kosher is the following. What do I consider food? That has a prior question, which is, what types of things is God okay with me eating? So if you're reading the scriptures, if you're concerned about the scriptures, there's a list in the scriptures. It's in Leviticus. Don't remember what chapter it's in.
I think he may have referenced it here. Leviticus 11.
And that chapter makes it very clear. Here are animals that can be eaten by humans, meaning that other animals are not on the approved list. But the problem is what we consider food is dictated by our culture. Whether you know it or not, the way you were raised, both from your family and your culture, tell you what you should normally eat. Okay, what is normal to eat? So it's more about allowed as normal. Now, what happens if your family or your culture says, well, we want to eat this animal, but it's not on the approved list? Well, then you have to make a choice between the list that God has said or the list that your culture permits you to eat. This has nothing whatsoever to do with if you are starving. If you, and I don't mean starving like you're an 8-year-old and you haven't eaten for an hour. That's not that. I mean seriously in danger of starving to death, like under wartime oppression, where you had cities in the Soviet Union that were feeding their people basically sawdust with a little flour in it as bread. They were eating their leather shoes. That's what I mean by starving. Is it okay to eat animals that are not on the approved list if I'm starving and God always says, yes, 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 yes? You're not going to get kicked out of Judaism if you are starving and you need to eat something not on the approved list. Is that clear to everybody? Because here's what I dislike more than a lot of other things. When Judaism is shown to be unreasonable. Being unreasonable would be, I can't eat that rabbit because it's not on the approved list, so I guess I'll starve to death, and that's what God wants me to do. That's wrong. That's never what Judaism says. It's unreasonable. Well, I guess if I eat that snake because there's nothing else to eat, I'll go to hell. Once again, totally 100% wrong. Wrong. Okay, everybody understands, because sometimes false choices are put out there by people who really distrust not just Judaism and the Old Testament, they really just distrust anything God says that didn't start with Matthew. So, and unfortunately, there are some food laws in the Newer Testament, but they assume this knowledge from Leviticus and from Jewish culture. It's hard sometimes to get through to people. Does that make sense to everybody? So, what does your culture say it's okay for you to eat? And we even differ from America and Europe. For example, in America, would you ever eat a horse? Would you get it from a restaurant
Or a grocery store.
or a grocery store as your choice of something to eat during the week? Never. And in some states, it's against the law to sell horse meat. However, you know where you can get horse meat anytime you want and there's stores for it? France. They eat horse. Yeah, everybody in America is going, oh, no, I'm not. Oh, no, thank you. No, thank you. Along with other people in France eat frog legs. People in America, a lot of them going to eat frog as a choice, not as I'm starving to death and I have to eat something. No, as a choice for Tuesday, we'll have frog's legs. And Americans are going, no, 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 no. How about bunny rabbits? We talked about bunny rabbits. Once again, normal in French food. But I don't think a lot of Americans are going to be thrilled with eating bunny rabbits. So this is a cultural thing. No matter what area of the world you come from, what your culture tells you is food is food. A big area, not in American culture, to eat is certain insects are perfectly fine to eat. The jumpers and the hoppers are perfectly fine to eat, not the ones that buzz around. These are hopping, because John the Presbyterian ate locusts because they're hoppers. And he might have said, yum, 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 but Americans are not touching that, right? Would you say? You might do it on a dare, but no, it's not a regular choice. So culture determines your diet and what you consider to be food. So is a book food? No. Is this mouse food? No, and not the other kind of mouse either. They're not food. See, it's an automatic category. You can say yes, food, or no food. In an emergency, there's a few things you would consider eating, correct? Yeah, but not your choice and not considered food under normal circumstances. Okay, so the definition of anything having to do with kosher depends on what your definition of acceptable food is. Your food definition can also come from your family. If you're from a strong immigrant family where you ate large amounts of food and dishes that came from particularly one nation or one area of the world, you would consider those casseroles as food, and other people would go, I ain't eating that on a bet. But it's really delicious. Depends on what you get used to.
This just popped in my mind.
Yes, sir.
As we were growing up in our Hungarian household that happened to be located in the Philadelphia suburbs, we never ate salad.
No, they didn't. When I joined the family, I'm going, there was not a head of lettuce, there was no lettuce, there was no tomatoes, there was no raw carrots, everything was cooked.
Because at that time, it wasn't part of the expected menu of food that you would eat. Now, later, my family did get involved in salads and the like, but not as I was growing up.
Not when I came into the family in 1972. Also, here's how they ate celery. They cooked celery like it was a vegetable. They boiled it and they served it. Cooked celery, stalks it. And I'm just going like, oh, interesting. Not normally what I would do with that kind of food, but see, it's your cultural background, right?
Yep.
Okay. Anyway, so do you want to hop along on that now, the kosher issue, or what it was it that you're going to add to anything?
Well, what I was going to do is summarize what was mentioned in the lead up to the question, and then bounce into Acts 15.
Go right ahead.
Or do you want to deal with God fears in any sense? Or do you
Not right now.
Not right now. Okay. Okay. The lead up to the question. Now, this is from the other questioner on the same question. It's my contention that not only within the Mosaic covenant, but also contained in the Noahide covenant, kosher is kosher and treif is treif. Let me rephrase that, because those are not the terms that are used there. But clean is clean and unclean is unclean is how the text is used. Or what is food and what is not is not. Genesis 7, Genesis 9, Leviticus 11. And then he says, and appropriately, and as we have discussed repeatedly in seminary, this is one of our students, former students, Shimon's vision in Acts 10 and 11 concerning the Gentiles has nothing to do with food, nor does Yeshua's proclamation in Mark 7. It has to do with utensils making food unclean, not making all animals kosher or clean. As hard as it would be in modern America to convince a Gentile believer that they should eat kosher or eat from clean animals, it would certainly not be nearly as difficult during biblical times in Israel that to be a Jew, the God-fearer of the alien or the convert, in every way a Jew, those that have chosen to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that regardless of what others, pagans and non-believers, eat food is food, and eat. Food is food, and non-food is non-food, as delineated in Leviticus. My question, is it not safe to say that because God instructs Noah to load the ark with the male and female of all unclean animals by twos, and by sevens all clean animals, knowing that flesh will become food and also acceptable for sacrifice, and that James makes clear that the Gentiles' commitment and obligation to the Messianic community, this now talking about Acts 15, is not to have to convert to Judaism, but to follow the Noahide covenant. And how to kill and eat an animal presupposes what animals are intended for food and which ones are not. That they should in fact be eating, at the very least, clean animals as described in Leviticus. And then the appropriate observation, when the Bible describes food in both the Brit Hadashah and the Tanakh, the Newer and Older Testaments, should we then gather from Leviticus 11 and Genesis 7 and 9 that the aforementioned food is the clean type for all of Noah's descendants? Which is a much more specific and honed in way of asking the same question that was asked earlier. What should Gentiles be eating? Now, the question becomes, who are Noah's descendants? Yeah, without exception. So the point that's being raised by this particular questioner, and he's raising it correctly, is if that's the case as Noah's descendants, and if there was a decision that divided between what is clean or non-clean, or as Priest was talking, what is to be considered food and what is not to be considered food, should not apply to all. Well, he mentions James. When we get to Acts chapter 15, the question is in fact raised as to what do non-Jewish followers of Yeshua do, or how should they live? And in effect, what you get in Acts chapter 15, and I think it's summarized in verses 19 to 21, has to do with 4 of what were then considered the 7 Noahide commandments. Why only 4? Well, as it turns out, the other 3 were already being enforced by the Roman Empire. And if you violated what was being enforced by the Roman Empire, you wouldn't be around too long to keep violating it. Yes, exactly. One of you already did that. Exactly. So only the 4 are mentioned. Now, what's striking is the 4 that are mentioned by James in Acts chapter 15 are basically a quotation of Hillel's, a generation earlier, the great Rabbi Hillel's answer to the question as to what should non-Jews be eating. And he describes the same 4 things that you find in Acts chapter 15. So if we're to take Acts 15 and the decision there of what was then called the Jerusalem Council, if we're to take that seriously, then the expectation for non-Jewish followers of Yeshua was to follow the Noahide covenant, and that would or commandments, and that involved what is food and what is not food.
For Jewish people.
Yeah.
For followers of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yes, whether you were, so if you were going to be a follower of Yeshua according to that particular instruction there, the assumption was you are to eat basically Jewish food as opposed to non-Jewish food.
In other words, the realm of food that was open to you, most likely is going to be much smaller than it had been in the Roman Empire. We actually have the menu of a couple of parties that Romans ate at these parties. And it's ridiculous, really, what they were eating. We'd never dream of eating the things that they ate nowadays. It almost sounds like, if you're familiar with Monty Python and the box of chocolates, and there's that strange box of chocolates that looks delicious on the outside, but inside has disgusting things like spring surprise, where metal springs, when you bite down in the candy, the metal springs plunge into your cheeks. And then there's frog
Delight.
It's frog delight, and it has to do with swimming in lark's vomit and, just disgusting things. And the list of what they ate at this party to you and I would be, literally, it had, you boil a stew of eyeballs from different birds and you pour it onto something else. It's this kind of a menu, and you're just going, oh my gosh, no wonder they thought the Jews were just crazy for not liking what the Romans were eating. I've always said, it's to our benefit as Americans that our diet very closely follows along the clean diet. There's just a couple things that we fall for that are not on the approved list. And the number one thing is, you're going to tell me, pig meat, right? Right? In fact, you probably know people who have said, I could never be Jewish because I would never give up bacon. Right? Because to Americans, I want to eat everything. And now you're telling me I can't eat everything? How dare you? That's ridiculous. I'm free to eat whatever disgusting animals I want to. Right? And to put sauce from those disgusting animals on every single other kind of food. But that's an American issue. But in general, our list of approval is very, very close compared to other nations in the world. And so we should be, I think, happy about that. That it's not like I can't eat anything I want to eat and I can only eat stuff I don't want to eat. We're really fortunate that it's not a big choice for us to make, correct? Just that pig thing. Hang on, and also the horse thing. And in a very wise book I read a long, long time ago, the author felt that the reason Americans have been used to eating pigs is because they have a lot of babies. But the reason why they don't eat a lot of horses because they only have one baby. So that you want to eat things where there's a lot of supply going to happen every day, whereas as opposed to animals that just have one baby at a time. That's not going to be such a good idea. But anyway, yes, I see the hand. You see her hand?
But
Oh, wait.
Before the hand, just a reflection. If you go to very traditional Jewish circles today as a non-Jew, and you want to get connected to the Jewish community, they're not going to encourage you to convert, but they will say you need to become a Noahide. In other words, live according to the Noahide guidelines, and that does include what is considered food and what is not considered food.
If you want to know what the 7 Noahide guidelines are, I recommend typing into your interweb machine the 7 laws of Noahide commandments, and it will tell you specifically what they are.
Did you want to say anything at all about God-fears? Or do we not need to at this point?
We don't need to. What you were talking about in Acts 15 is that part of the thing that the James and the apostles were concerned about, a couple of them have to do with the food thing. Don't eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols, isn't it? And you and I might think, well, that's sort of silly because, who cares if something's been killed to worship? Who cares? It doesn't matter. It's just molecules of the food. But it's not the appearance. And some of the Noahide commandments are the appearance of what you're doing. I would say that's also another one of the Noahide commandments is don't eat flesh off of a living animal. In other words, don't cut a leg off the sheep, eat the leg, and then let the sheep walk around with 3 legs. Because it's cruel, it's inhumane. And Dr. Strange, our buddy, during one class, we were discussing this whole thing about don't eat a leg off of a living animal. In other words, if you're going to eat an animal, you kill it in the humane, kosher way, and drain its blood, and then you're free to enjoy it. But don't eat a leg off of somebody who would have used that leg had you would still be using the leg. And he said, yeah, on the farm, we used to joke about, yeah, the pig was so good, I'll have to eat the other leg next week. And, that was like a joke, except sort of not a joke.
One further reflection, and that is frequently we are told that in the late Second Temple period, in areas where, and a lot of areas of the Roman Empire did have Jewish communities, but in areas where there are Jewish communities to be found, frequently even the non-Jews would go to kosher markets for their food.
Because it was seen as helpful and very sanitary.
Okay, did the first question
Easy 2
come?
hands.
Did it come from the Romans or from?
I have no idea.
Okay, well, Barbara.
Okay, my question is in Acts 15, there seems to be a clear distinction between the Noahide eating commandments and what the Jews of the day are eating. And I'm wondering is it talking about halakha more so than actually what Leviticus says versus what the Noahide commandments say? Because I don't see a big difference between the Leviticus and the Noahide.
On this issue, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's more of a matter of emphasis rather than here's some whole new stuff. This is not whole new stuff in Acts 15. This is what they're concerned about, rather than they're not doing it now, and now they have to do this.
2 reflections from my perspective. Number 1, remember that this is virtually a quote of Hillel's answer to what should the Gentiles do if they want to follow God. And as others have noticed, it involves 4 of the 7 Noahide commandments. So that's issue number 1. Issue number 2 is it does appear, quick aside, I believe it's in Leviticus 17 to 19, by the way, also mention these same 4 things as to how Gentiles are supposed to function within the Jewish community. So already by the time of Leviticus, they had begun to pick up on this, going back to the time of Noah. And then, like I said, Hillel was perceptive enough to say, well, this is the way in which Gentiles are supposed to participate within the believing community. So I'm not sure. I don't know if that answered your question, Barbara, or not.
It's pretty good. I just, being Gentile and having a lot of Gentile friends, I'm constantly trying to explain this. And of course, the one thing I keep telling them, they're like, well, I don't get it. And I'm like, okay, what was the first thing that got us into trouble? It's eating the apple from the tree. This whole food thing is important.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we want to get it right.
And please remember the very practical implication of this as well. And I'm sure Hillel understood this also. If you're going to share a meal in the community, it needs to be a meal that the community can actually eat.
Yes.
So that's why this becomes important in both Hillel's response to the question and then the Jerusalem Council, the apostolic response to the question. Because after all, it was supposed to be for all people who are descendants of Noah. And oh, by the way, if you're going to be able to eat with us, then here's how you're going to be able to eat with us. Okay. The Romans. Which one of the Romans is asking the question?
That would be me.
Okay.
Okay, then you would be.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that Jew and Gentile alike are essentially supposed to function within the same diet. And an argument maybe against that, I guess, that I've heard from others within the Messianic community is that, like in Deuteronomy 14:21, it's the instruction is given: do not eat anything you find already dead. You may give it to the foreigner residing in any of your towns. They may eat it, or you may sell it to any other foreigner. And so what I've understood is that the foreigner residing in the town is, the God-fearing kind of Gentile who's attached themselves to Israel is therefore not required to follow the same dietary restrictions that the Jewish person is. I guess that would be my question. What would be am I misunderstanding your point, or how would you reconcile that with that? Because I don't care, I don't have a egg in the basket on whatever God says I do or don't eat. That's what I do and don't eat. I'm just wanting to try and reconcile those two things, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I'm just rereading the text and its context.
In Deuteronomy 15, is that
14.
or 14? Okay.
14, no.
I have a couple of general comments when he's done.
Okay. I think Deuteronomy 14 acknowledges the fact that certainly until the time that the land is totally conquered, you're going to be interacting with those who are either part of the community or those who are not part of the community. Here it's talking about the issue is dead or alive. Now, if it leaves open the possibility that this animal, were it alive, you could eat it, then what does that tell you about the nature of the animal that's it's the focus of this particular text? It obviously is already a clean animal.
It would normally qualify as food,
It would already qualify as food, or the question wouldn't even come up.
not a possum or a badger.
The only difference is it dead or not dead? And the reason for that whole discussion coming up is because you're supposed to drain the blood from the animal. If it's dead and you start eating it, the blood hasn't been drained. You kill it in a way so the blood is drained as part of the slaughtering process. So that would be my initial response to that issue. And as I said, you already have the instructions in Leviticus 17 through 19 as to what those who live among you,
As opposed to an alien.
as opposed to those who live in your towns. In other words, those who become part of your community, there's a distinction from those who are not part of your community.
And I think in all, it's a matter of the death of this animal. It's not a matter of, is the animal on the approved list? Now we're talking about the manner of death and the fact that the blood was left in the animal. Is it okay to eat it? And the answer always from God is going to be, you never waste the death of an animal. There will be an accounting for all death. And animals count in that. In other words, will be held to account for animals that we killed. And then what happened? Was it thrown away? Was it wasted? Then the life of this animal, even though we don't consider it very strongly, that doesn't mean that God doesn't consider it very strongly.
One further qualifier in that Deuteronomy 14:21 text is, I've given you these instructions because you are a people who are to be holy to the Lord your God. So my response, my off the cuff and somewhat tongue-in-cheek automatic response would be, in answer to someone raising this question, do you want to be part of a people who are holy to your God? Well, if you want to be part of a people who are holy to your God, then follow the rest of the instructions. And in effect, that's what the Acts 15 builds on. Those who are part of the community need to eat the stuff that's part of the community. What is this community? This community that's holy to God. And I think what Patrice just mentioned a minute or two ago falls in here as well. And that is, if someone is hungry and is in need of food, you make sure that there is something that they are able to use as food.
And I think we also need to
Even
make,
if it's dead.
even if it's dead, we need to make it very clear. So what happens if you accidentally ate a piece of meat that had not been slaughtered in the kosher way and it still had blood in it? Now what will happen to me? The answer is never, I'm going to hell. That's never the correct answer. Does that make sense? Tell your friends, because I think people get totally goofed up on this. What is the normal remedy if you are in transgression of one of these principles? Well, normally you're going to bathe, you're going to wash your clothes, you're not going to be able to enter the tabernacle for about 24 hours afterwards, and then you're fine. There is no condemnation more than 24 hours. So it's not unreasonable. The things that God wants us to do are not unreasonable, even in modern times, especially in modern times. If you have a good washing machine, you have a fabulous shower head, and you wait the 24 hours, you're good. You're good. It's fine. There's no hell for making mistakes as long as you follow through and clean up. It's not a big deal. But somehow, anything that we feel we have to do, it becomes a big deal. It shouldn't be like that. We should all naturally be saying, I want to serve God. How can I do that? What does He want me to do? And the answers come from there.
And again, let's remember that the Deuteronomy 14 text is talking about a dead animal or an animal that qualifies for food but happens to be dead. An animal that qualifies for food but happens to be dead. In other words, were it alive, a Jewish person could then slaughter it and eat it. So if you're going to work from that text and determine your diet from that text, you still end up having to do what? Eating from what is called food or clean animals.
Killed in the correct.
And, well, hopefully killed in the correct way, but I mean, even if you take the the exception here.
Yeah, and what's the danger in eating meat, quote unquote, that still has the blood in it? Well, there's several diseases that you can get. You know, good luck with that. Do whatever you need to do. Even when you eat blood sausage in other countries, in America, it's not as big a thing as it is in Scotland, in Poland. They all have blood sausage. They go, yum, yum, yum. Why won't you like to eat this? Well, at least the method of making the sausage where the blood is part of the yummy part is it gets boiled. But if you're eating roadkill, yeah, good luck with that. Hope it works out for you. I will stay over here and you eat it over there. And it'll all be good.
Does that answer the question sufficiently, Skylar?
I think so. At least gives me good food for thought to chew on more. I'm sure that I'll come up with more questions on tangentially related, but yeah, that gives me, I think that's a good answer.
I was going to say, it's people who, I mean, you mentioned that you thought there were Messianic Jews. No Messianic Jews that I know of would ever even consider eating roadkill. So whatever person who identified themselves as a Messianic Jew, yeah, they don't belong to any group I know about. Because
and to clarify, they were saying that the rule for the Jewish community is absolutely a hard, fast no, but for the Gentile believer in Messiah, it's a different rule.
Yes, as an exception, it is, but as a general rule, the rule is, the exception part is that it's dead, not whether or not it's clean or unclean. Is that at least clear from that text?
Yeah, I think so. They were applying it to clean and unclean distinctions, but
That's what I had a feeling that's what they were trying to do. And then you still got to work around what's the very clear instruction that's deriving in Acts chapter 15 in answer to just that specific question.
in Acts 15, remember, these are people who do want to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When you've got that situation in Deuteronomy, give it to somebody who doesn't care about following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's fine. Who cares about that? But this is about what do we do if we're a Gentile and want to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Well, you got to read these instructions here and take them seriously.
Okay, any other questions?
Does Barbara have her
Well,
hand
it
up?
related to what you're talking about there. Part of, because most of us Gentiles have to think twice about eating kosher. What helped me out in the beginning was the idea that I don't want to be a stumbling block. And so definitely with my Jewish community, I started eating kosher, and then I got to where I eat kosher all the time. But then I got confronted with the idea that sometimes I'm with a Gentile community, and as far as I can get away with it, I eat kosher. But then sometimes if it's served directly to me, I'm like, ooh, I don't want to be a stumbling block for them either. Well, Lord, 24 hours. Okay, I'm just going to count on your grace. Is that a cop out?
It depends. It depends on the situation. And here's what I mean. It could possibly be a teaching opportunity, but it could also possibly, depending on the situation, could be offensive. There is still a third alternative, and that is that you just eat that which is appropriate and not eat that which is not appropriate on your plate.
And frankly, and we've been doing this now for almost 50 years, we just say no, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody anymore,
Is offended by that.
you can always say health reasons too. That's another thing you can say. I'm trying to cut down on that kind of thing. So I'll just eat the salad. Thank you very much. And people understand that. When we go here's something that my daughter and I use. So we were on a tour when she graduated from high school. We went on a tour of the British Isles. And as we went to the different, they give you the giant breakfast in the hotel, which is full of bacon and sausage and ham and whatever they put on the plate. And so she and I just would say, we want the vegetarian breakfast. Oh, no problem. No questions asked. No offense. No, it's great. Thank you very much. We'd like the vegetarian option. Oh, good. Super. Nobody got offended. It was great. And she and I both thought, thank you, God. So we didn't have to keep, dealing with this topic that every morning we just said, we won't eat any meat. Thank you very much. But we like eggs. Eggs are good. So,
Okay, any further questions on this? It's not, it's a somewhat complex topic, and it is in some sense situational. And obviously much more could be said. And you only got the beginnings of that in the summary that the other person who raised this question included in his question, as he summarized what he felt was the issue. And by the way, this person who raised that question was himself not Jewish.
also, I would just want to mention when you said you don't want to be a stumbling block to the Gentile believers, I'm assuming that you're hanging out with. Here's the thing. It's not unknown that when Jewish believers they meet Gentile believers sometimes want, I think it's almost like a purity test. Well, then I'm going to give you a ham sandwich, and to prove that you are a believer, you need to eat the ham sandwich. Otherwise, you're not a believer. And that's cruel in and of itself, of them. So that's why another reason I would sort of say I really don't care if they're offended. I don't mean to offend them, but I do mean to live by my faith. And that means I'll just have salad. Thank you very much. That's all I want. I'm not going to give them a lecture on how dare you eat unclean. It's not my business to do it then. But when you hear of the opposite being pulled on Jewish believers, it's very difficult to not feel angry because they don't realize it's not funny to joke around about that, and nobody should be forced into that situation.
And here's another sort of tongue-in-cheek response, not just for this, but for others related. If it was good enough for Jesus and the apostles, it's good enough for me.
Oh, now we're free from the law.
Yeah, see that's why they shoved the ham sandwich in people's faces. All right, further interaction on this?
I'm so glad we cleared everything up.
Yep. All right. If you do, we can pursue it further in further weeks. We still do have a couple more questions that we did not get to answer.
We didn't even talk about milk and meat, so.
No, we did not even get there. Okay, in that case, would you be kind enough to close?
I
the
do.
prayer? Since I opened, you get to close.
Okay. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, we thank you and praise you that we can learn about you, that we can study your word, that we can understand why you've given us these principles that to live by, why you care about us and want only the best for us. We thank you that you're so faithful to us, even when we are not faithful to you many times. Help us to always follow the footsteps that you leave us. Help give us inquiring minds and give us peace and confidence as we walk forward, as we reach out to others. Thank you for using us, and thank you for giving us everything we have. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua our Messiah. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry we ran a little long, but we ran a little long because you had some extra questions, so
It's fine.
it's your fault, not ours.
We won't charge you for the overtime, really. It's free overtime.
And
Thank
by the
you.
way, oh, thank you. And
Thank
by
you.
the-
These sessions are always so informative.
Well, thank you for
Thank
saying
you
that.
for
I
saying
learn
that.
something all the time.
Now, speaking of these sessions, this is the last one for the year. So we'll see you in January, which means we now need to wish you Happy Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
All those.
All those. And but of course, you're more than welcome to join us for services any Friday night in between, and especially on the 23rd.
23rd is going to be, I think it's going to be a really great service. Very unusual.
Now, it's the Shabbat of Hanukkah week, but because it's only a day or so removed from what we call Rishon or Yom Mashiach, we're going to bring in those elements as part of a combined service. Often we will have on the evening of the 24th a Rishon or Yom HaMashiach service, but since this is the day before, we thought it might be just as well, given our people's inclinations, to combine it all in wrap it up in one big fancy bow. So there we go.
So it won't be the same old, same old. There'll be new stuff in it.
And what time on Friday nights?
7:30
7:30 is when we start.
Eastern time.
But you can get it anytime during the week because it's taped and you can watch it.
It goes up,
whenever it's
it goes up on
convenient.
Vimeo, but if you're going to join us live, then you can catch us on YouTube.
Thank you for not cutting it off when you're saying goodnight to us, because it was cutting off too short for a while there. And last night was perfect.
Cool, good.
And
Thank you for that feedback, Virginia. It's appreciated.
and the other is thank you and continue to pray. Zachary has been reading his grandfather's Bible, and he's had some